The Boise State Public Radio app. News, music, and more.
Idaho Matters.
Morning Edition.
All things considered.
The Connector.
And more.
And more.
You can take us wherever you go and stay connected. Without it, you're missing out. Download it free.
You can also communicate using the Talk to Us tab.
The Boise State Public Radio app.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Samantha Wright, filling in for Jim Gaudette. It's Idaho Matters. In recent decades, wildfires have gotten larger and more intense, and community-destroying blazes like the Marshall and the Camp Fires are an increasingly common occurrence. But new research looking at centuries of wildfires is showing that compared with fires in the 19th and earlier centuries, today's blazes pale in comparison, at least in terms of size. And that research is providing some support for the idea that prescribed burns and other interventions could reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires. The Mountain West News Bureau's Murphy Woodhouse took a look at the new study. He's joining us to tell us more. Hi, Murphy.
Good morning, Sam.
Okay, tell us about this study. What did it find?
Yeah, I mean, some of the top-line findings are just really eye-popping. So using a very large and relatively new source of data called the North American Tree Ring Fire Scar Network, or NAFSN, I might refer to that later, they were able to look at the historical frequency and extent of wildfires literally as far back as 1600, the year 1600, and all the way from Alaska down to Mexico. But yeah, we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but it's a truly impressive data set. But what they found is that in terms of scale, at least, and we're just talking about scale here, the last 4 or so decades of wildfire pales in comparison to wildfires over a nearly 3-century period from 1600 to 1880. So in terms of area, they estimate that on average, fires today burn less than a quarter of what fires did in that almost 300-year period. And here's another data point that I think further drives the point home. So 2020, as many of our listeners will remember, was a very heavy recent fire season. It burned some 10.1 million acres nationwide, and it also burned 6% of the sites in this NAFSN network, the burn scar network. But that 6% figure, that was the average for the historical period. And the record for that historical period was nearly 30%. So let's listen to paper co-author Don Falk summarize all of this.
This is maybe the most counterintuitive result from the whole study. The way we see fire in the media and hear about it, it seems like the whole world is exploding with fire. That's actually not true. There's less fire now than there was historically.
I think this is fascinating. He says it's counterintuitive, but are Falk and his co-authors saying there's nothing exceptional about what's happening now?
Oh, absolutely not. And yeah, this is a very key point. So in recent decades, fires have indeed been growing in size compared to fires from earlier in the 20th century. But that, of course, breaks down as soon as you take the longer historical view that they have here. But what is truly unprecedented, Falk says, is the severity of fires and their destructiveness. So, I mean, we have Fort McMurray in Alberta, if I remember correctly, Paradise, California, Lahaina in Hawaii, Los Angeles. There are just so many recent examples of whole communities and neighborhoods just literally being wiped off the map. And so Falk explains this trend in several ways. One, we have high fuel loads that are one of the key legacies of decades of suppression-first wildfire policy, or another way of saying that, just the long-standing bias toward extinguishing fires as quickly as possible. There's also the exacerbating effects of climate change, as well as the rapid development of the so-called wildland-urban interface, which are just structures built on or near land that needs to burn and absolutely inevitably will burn.
And okay, so we mentioned that he says these findings may seem counterintuitive. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really interesting discussion and one that's especially relevant to us in the media. So, you know, as the paper acknowledges, you know, wildfires have indeed been getting bigger in recent decades. So the findings do seem to fly in the face of that reality. But Don also says that there's actually a role played by the media. So let's hear more from him.
This is a problem in the media reporting of fire because, of course, we're drawn to the catastrophic events. Most of the time, both prescribed and even wildfires are burning at low and moderate severity. There
Yeah.
is a lot of that fire still happening. It's just that we don't hear about it. And so our view and our understanding of fire is being shaped by the focus on these more catastrophic events.
Yeah, so I think for all of us who cover wildfire, that certainly includes myself. It's just a very important and good faith criticism to have in mind. Just are we potentially in the ways that we're covering fire, are we leading to this? I mean, ultimately, fairly inaccurate notion of what's actually happening out there.
So what does all this mean for land management? What is the study teaching us?
Yeah, so I mean, there are obviously a lot of management implications to all of this, but I think that they can, in a lot of ways, just be kind of summarized by the need to put a lot more beneficial fire on the ground to get back to the historic norm of much more widespread but less intense fire. And I think this is actually something worth just painting in a little bit more detail. So, we do see spectacular, catastrophic wildfires now. I mean, like Los Angeles, Oklahoma, the Carolinas, just this year. I mean, we're already on our way to having a quite historic season. But yeah, fire today just looks very, very different from what it would have during this, nearly 3-century period analyzed with these tree ring records. So while it was much more widespread, it looked very different. It was much more low and medium intensity. So these are, I think right now, because of some of the things that Don has discussed here, we have this notion of wildfire being kind of universally destructive and intense, when in fact, what would have been the case in previous centuries was, I mean, utterly pervasive, just everywhere all the time, but burning in such a way that it rarely, if ever, would represent a risk to the built environment. And so in the paper, just to give you an idea of the sort of scale we're talking about here, they're calling for a 10 to 100-fold increase in prescribed fire and other similar fuels reduction practices. So let's hear from Don again.
The amount of money that we're investing in suppressing fire, which creates these huge catastrophic events, if we put that same amount into returning fire safely to the landscape, we would see a revolution in land management because forests would be healthier and more resilient. You have to learn to think about fire in a different way. You have to learn to think of fire as your friend.
Yeah, I think that idea, like really kind of, getting away from this notion of fire as a universal kind of definitional threat, and really seeing it as the core ecological underpinning that it is. But so he emphasized prescribed fire and what we just heard, but he also spoke very highly of the many indigenous traditions of cultural burning and efforts to reestablish or promote them. So I did some recent reporting this year on similar efforts among the Karuk of Northern California. And Don says that we just have a lot to learn from such practices. And just to give listeners just a very brief summary of the scale of that sort of historic indigenous burning on a large swath of Karuk territory in Northern California. Recent research there has suggested that what would have been typical prior to colonization was as many as 7,000 annual intentional ignitions by cultural fire practitioners that burned every single year, 15% of that territory, meaning that basically every decade, most ground is seeing fire. And that's just something that we don't see anymore because of the sort of suppression first mindset.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left. How did this data come to be? How did it all come about?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this is such a key a part of the story. So what are we talking about when we're talking about this burn scar network? This is nearly 1,800 sites scattered across the country. Obviously, a lot of them are in the American West, but really kind of covering a vast number of different ecosystems and terrains and all of that. So it really just kind of provides this, I mean, what Don himself calls an unprecedented, at a global scale, an unprecedented level of historic knowledge about just the scale and intensity and extent of historic wildfires. But, now that we have some of those numbers, I think it's easier to imagine that this was just an utterly massive, tedious, lengthy collective effort. So certainly involving university professors like himself, but also many, many federal scientists. And let's hear from Don one last time about what those federal scientists are out there doing.
It's one of the things that federal scientists do that I think the public in general does not appreciate, that these are hardworking, highly trained scientists working every day to understand various aspects of an environment.
Yeah, and the reason, I mean, he wanted to talk about this very explicitly with me, and the reason he wanted to do so was precisely because in recent weeks with these mass firings, he says that a lot of that work is, I mean, the way that he described that to me was that work is being cut off at the knees by these mass firings and all of the the chaos and uncertainty that we've been seeing among many federal workers. I mean, just to cite an example of that, I mean, the reporting I was doing up in McCall in the wake of the firings among Forest Service workers, I mean, one of the folks I spoke to was a PhD biologist, ultimately reinstated by some of these court orders, or was at least supposed to. But I mean, many of these firings have directly impacted the sorts of scientists that Don is talking about here.
Well, it's a fascinating study. Murphy, thanks for bringing it to us.
Absolutely. I always appreciate the time to go deep on stuff like this.
This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudet.